Hi, this is Jerry Rothhauser, and I'm your tour guide to take a tour and a journey through the Bible in a year. And I hope you've been following along with us to do that. And we started the beginning of the year in January, which makes sense. And now we've already gotten to week 10 already. We're into March of 2017. Amazing, isn't it? And how much ground we've already traversed, probably almost as much as the Jews did in the wilderness. How's that for a segue? Well, we're going to be in Numbers chapter 4 through the end of chapter 16, and then Mark 12:18 through 15:47, and Psalm 48 through 54, and Proverbs 10:26 through chapter 11 and verse 6. So we're going to be in the book of Numbers, and I didn't mention much about that last week, even though you read 3 chapters in Numbers. And the first few chapters there, if you're having trouble sleeping, the best thing to do is go online to ESV Bible, I think it is, .com or esvonline.com, and they have a great narrator, and he can read all of that to you. You can just lay in your bed and listen to it and fall asleep. But then you need to wake up when we get to some of these other chapters in Numbers, because they're pretty exciting. And what are they about? Well, what they are about, the book of Numbers is about Moses writing for the Israelites, their history, and that's really important, and also how they should conduct themselves in the wilderness and how they should prepare to conduct themselves when they get into the Promised Land. But some of these stories are just outrageous. You need to read them. They're just fantastic. One of them was put in a movie, The 10 Commandments. And in that movie, there was a big star who mostly played the part of a mobster. His name was Edgar G. Robinson, and he plays the part of Korah. And that story, and we're going to get into that in depth, in Numbers chapter 16, where Edgar G. Robinson is being featured, and he was in the movie. It was Korah. We're going to get to the Korah of the issue. As you know, I'm a punster. So, not a munster, but a punster. And what do I mean by that? I think the theme of the entire Bible is death leads to, or rebellion leads to death, and relationship with God leads to life. And you're really going to see that as we get into the book of Numbers, of course, the whole rest of the Bible. And the way I would label the Jews in this book, particularly, they were, excuse me if you've got kids, and you're homeschooling them, and then you hear this guy on the podcast and he says this, they're whiny butts. That's really, how can you say it another way? They're whiny butts. Because all they do is gripe and complain, and they give a hard time to Moses all the time. In Exodus, they were already complaining about their food, and so God gave them manna, and it was like, what is this stuff? And that's what manna means. And they wanted water, and they got water, and then you're going to see in Numbers, they wanted meat. It's like, oh, well, we had vegetables and fish and whatever when we were in Egypt. Yeah, well, you also got whipped. Hello? Anyway, so God gave them quail, not Dan or potatoes. Inside joke if you're a Hoosier. Anyway, God gave them meat. Now here's the deal. The Israelites had to traverse about 240 miles. 240 miles to cover the wilderness, and they didn't make it. They didn't make it, except for two guys. Not even Moses made it. They didn't make it 240 miles. It took them 40 years, their descendants made it, but the original people didn't make it, the 240 miles, to make it to the promised land. Why? Because it wasn't just a journey, as someone has called it, it was a death sentence. A lot of people died in the wilderness, and in fact, all of them, except for any of the children who were 20 years and older, are all perished. So 20 and under, they made it. And after that, those older people didn't make it. To think about this, in Numbers 14:34, the penalty was because there were spies sent out by God to see what the promised land looked like. That was in Numbers 13. And only 2 of them came back with a positive report. There was only a handful of the spies. And so the 2 that came back with a positive report were Caleb and Joshua. That was it. And so they were the only 2 that made it into the promised land. So we'll get to that. But I did the math on this. So God punished them, according to Numbers 14:34, 40 years wandering around in the wilderness because of their 40 days of spying, and came back with a negative report. They were whiny butts, sorry. Okay, it took 6 hours, you would say, to get 20 miles a day. So that would be 12 20-mile treks if it was 240 miles, right? So that would be a total of 72 hours to walk, like 3 straight days of walking. So that's not long, but they were 40 years out there. If it was a 6-hour day of walking times 12, it'd be 72 hours, 3 days straight, and you could make it conservatively 6-hour days in 12 days if you were taking a break and sleeping at night, right? Sad, isn't it? But God said, no, you're not going to make it. Well, all right. So, I've been accused of talking about things out of my life too often. Now, if anyone reads anything about preachers' lives, they always preach out of their lives. In fact, I used to use books of illustrations. I was taught that in seminary. And I decided at a certain point that why would I use these stale stories when I have vivid ones out of my own life? So that's what I did, and that's what I do. And so first thing I would do is, if you're a prospective preacher, see, that's alliteration, and that's good to use alliteration in sermons. But if you're a prospective preacher, it's good to use things out of your life and take this advice that I got. I was going to a huge church in Atlanta. In fact, you would know that church, most likely. And I'm going to mention Charles Stanley or First Baptist of Atlanta. I'm not even going to mention that. I was teaching in the college group there, which had some really bright students in there because they were going to Georgia Tech, engineers. They were bright. Anyway, I got called to the ministry while I was there. I felt like God wanted me to go to seminary and to learn and to go out and pastor. And when I did, I went to the leader of the paid pastor of the college group, and I said to him, I think I'm called to the ministry, but how would I know? And he said, well, the preacher preached a sermon on that not long ago on a rhema. A rhema means word in Greek. And you should get a word from God out of the scripture that kind of hits you over the head and that you can fall back on, because when you go into the ministry, it can be really, really difficult. In fact, there could be times that you just want to give up and get out of the ministry. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. I thought I had been in the charismatic movement. Now he's telling me something that's kind of charismatic-y. I know it's not a word, but you know what I mean. So I was telling my wife about that night, and I had my Bible open on the bed. I was telling her about it, and I was thumbing through looking for something, and it just opened to Jeremiah 13, and around verse 15 and following. And it was as if it was, the print was lifted up off of the page. I thought, boy, that's strange. And I looked at it, and one thing it said was, where's the flock that I've given you? I thought, uh-oh. And I read more there. But anyway, it's in Jeremiah 13:15. And so, sure enough, things got tough in the ministry, and I had to more than once look back at that scripture. In fact, whenever I get a new Bible, which is a lot, I always mark that scripture in each of the books, in each of the Bibles. And you're going to see what I'm talking about in the life of Moses. That poor guy, he had to put up with all of these, have I characterized them already? Whiny butts. In the book of Numbers, and you've already seen it in Exodus. But anyway, let's just kind of glean through these chapters before we kind of settle into chapter 16. Chapter 5, and I'm not going to just go through everything, because we're trying to get through the Bible in a year. So what I'm trying to do for you is hit the high points and the confusing things and the important points of doctrine. That's what I'm trying to do. And so one thing to note, that this long trip that shouldn't have been a long trip, should have been a short trip, was a long trip, was like our second phase of salvation. You know, I've talked about that before. 3 tenses, verbs of salvation, or 3 phases of salvation. First is you get saved, and then you're secure. So don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You look at the scriptures, and if you look at the tense, you'll see that we were justified. We were saved. John 5:24. We're going to go to heaven if you trusted him. And then there's a phase of separation, of sanctification, where we should become more like Jesus. And then thirdly, you go to heaven, everything's taken care of. But this journey through the wilderness is a journey of sanctification for the Israelites. They experience suffering, and they either turn toward God or they turn away from him. Pharaoh, same thing. Pharaoh was accosted by Moses on various occasions where God was trying to get Pharaoh's attention. And every time, even when it looked like Pharaoh was finally going to do what God wanted him to do, he didn't do it. And so the phrase that we use that explains that, and also explains the way the Jews, a number of the Jews acted in the wilderness, was that the same sun that melts the butter hardens the clay. So suffering in someone's life either turns them into like a more Christ-like person or makes them a worse sinner. Anyway, that's what's going on in this story about the Israelites in the wilderness. And it represents our sanctification as Christians. Now here's, I didn't mention, but there's an offering for sin. And if you were poor, you would give turtle doves. And the only reason I mention that is because Jesus' parents must have been poor, because that was the offering that they gave for Jesus, was turtle doves. But this is a strange thing in Numbers 5, and I didn't mention the tribes in the beginning chapters, but in the beginning chapters, the 12 tribes were outlined. And you may be puzzled when you read that, because you're going to find that Joseph is not mentioned and Levi is not mentioned, but Manasseh and Ephraim are mentioned. That's because Ephraim and Manasseh were sons of Joseph, so Joseph drops out in favor of his sons, and later on they get allotments in the promised land, and Levi drops out because Levi and his descendants become the priests, and so they don't get their own section of land. They end up being priests in each of the other 12 tribes' area. Okay, now, Numbers 5, there's a test for adultery for women. And so if a man suspected his wife to be guilty of adultery, he would take her to the priests, and she would have to drink a concoction of dust mixed with holy water. And if she was guilty, her insides were rot out. She wouldn't be able to have kids. That's what happened. If she was innocent, then you'd have a happy husband. All right. Now, if you're thinking what I'm thinking, and I know that you are, right? Why is there a test for women and there's no test for men? What's the deal on that? Well, if a husband is jealous and he portrays Christ to the church, and a woman portrays the church, if you look that up in the New Testament, then the Lord, it says in Scripture, is jealous for us. Like I've told you, it's all about relationship. But that doesn't explain why there is not a test for the husband. Well, in Deuteronomy, it spells out that anyone who's guilty of adultery, there's a penalty for that, and it's extreme. We'll get to that. But you're still saying, why for the wife and not for the husband? Because if he loves her and she loves him, she proves out to be innocent, and she can be a happy wife. He can be a happy husband. And I think, too, what we don't think about often is back in these days, what are they doing? They're traveling, they're nomads, and they're in tents. And I think everyone knows everyone else. It's more like when you see a Western and everyone went to the general store, everyone went to one church, everyone knew each other. It's not like 2000, whatever year you're in when you're listening to this, where you don't hardly even know your next door neighbors. It's not like that. Everyone knew everyone else. And so if a husband's going to test his wife, everyone in the community is going to know about it. So if he's been fooling around, he's going to get in trouble, and he'll incur the penalty from Deuteronomy. Numbers 8 talks about the Levites. Those are not guys that wore Levi's. As I mentioned, those are the priests. They get singled out. And in Numbers 8, it says that they are instead of the firstborn of each one of the family. So God said, no, I'm not going to have the firstborn of each family be a priest. What I'm going to do is just take the Levites, and they'll be the priests. And then there's a lot in the book of Numbers about what it means to be a priest, what they should do, the rituals, etc. In number 6, how did I skip that? There is the Nazirite vow, because I was talking about priests and Levites. A person could take a Nazirite vow and not cut his hair and not touch a corpse and be set apart for the Lord. Also not drink any alcohol. Now, the most famous one of those type people of a Nazirite and taking a Nazirite vow was Samson. And we'll talk about him when we'll get to the book of Judges. He didn't cut his hair. Well, he did, but he shouldn't have. And other people think that maybe Samuel took a Nazirite vow, or maybe John the Baptist, or maybe Jesus' brother, James. But I'm not sure that there's evidence of any of them completely taking that vow like Samson. We get to Numbers 9. God reminds everyone that there's a Passover feast. We talked about the feasts, I think it was last week. And then in Numbers 11, well, I mentioned the quail already. And has your mother ever said anything like this? Be careful what you ask for. Has your mom ever said that to you? Has your father ever said to you, I'll give you something to cry about if you're going to keep trying like that? Mine did. I think too often. But anyway, here's what happened in Numbers 11. The whiny butts complained about not having any meat. So God said, all right, I'll give you meat. You want meat? I'll give you meat. Verse 20 in Numbers 11 says, they got so much meat, it just dropped down out of the sky. The wind blew it in, actually. And they were quail, and they had all kinds of meat. And then they got sick because they ate it all, and it came out their nostrils, it says. It came out their nostrils. Is that disgusting? And there was a plague, and they died. So be careful what you ask for. They should have just been happy with the manna. You know, they were able to bake it and cook it and eat it raw. I mean, they should have been happy with the manna. But, you know, how much are we like these Jews? Complaining about things God supplies, and, you know, we get an iPod, but no, we want an iPhone. But we get an iPhone, oh no, we want the latest iPhone. We need a new computer. Okay, I'm projecting, aren't I? Anyway, Numbers 12, even his own brother and sister started complaining about him. His sister, his brother was Aaron, and he was in on this too. And Miriam, not the librarian from The Music Man, it was his sister. And guess what happened to her? Well, you would think she would be pink with envy, but no, she was white with envy because she got leprosy. And whenever you notice the Jews complaining about things, the next thing you read about is Moses intercedes for them. Who is that like? Our big brother, Jesus, who always intercedes for us according to the book of Hebrews. So, in this case, no exception, Moses prayed for Miriam, and God said, if she had disrespected, anyone, her father would have spit in her face, because that was a penalty for that kind of disrespect. And she'd have to be considered unclean for 7 days. So Moses took that deal. So did Miriam. So did Aaron. So Miriam had to separate herself from the camp for 7 days. And then she was let back in and she repented, which was a smart thing to do. Then the spies that I mentioned, they were sent out in Numbers 13, and they came back with a negative report. I had a friend that was in the charismatic movement, and one of the things they believe is you shouldn't say negative things. Well, that's a little extreme. But if you're whining all of the time and grumbling all of the time, that's not a good thing. And so they came back, and as a result, only 2 of them was able to make it into the promised land after the end of this wilderness journey. In Numbers 15, in the ESV, the English Standard Version, it talks about a high-handed sin, a high-handed sin. In other words, you purposely sinning. And I talked about that last week in depth, so I don't need to cover that again. High-handed is the kind of sin where you sin against God right in his face, and you're never going to give it up, and you're never going to trust him. So anyone who doesn't trust Christ will not make it into the promised land of heaven. And a lot of these Jews were sinning with a high hand. That's because they opposed God directly. And in fact, when they were opposing Moses directly, they were opposing God. That gets us to number 16 and the story that I had in my church out in the country for 10 years. But Moses had it much worse. He had Korah and his direct family and some other Levites come against him. And in they rose up, it says, rose up in verse 2 against Moses. In verse 3, as a group, they came to Moses and Aaron and said, "You have gone too far." And guess what Moses said to him? "No, you've gone too far." All right, so I'll show you. God said, bring your censer, which is your fire pan that they would use in ritual worship, and bring it and put it in the fire and see who God chooses. So, the net result of that was Korah came against God with 250 other men, and God told Moses to tell them to move away from Korah and two of the other guys, Dathan and Abiram. That name has significance if you were in the Fisher's band, especially if you... Poor guy. We need to pray for him. Anyway, in Dathan, in the scripture, it says God was going to do something new. Boy, was it new. And so the rest of the Jews moved away from them. And it says the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their households and all those associated with Korah together with their possessions. They died and fell into the earth that cracked open. And a fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering the incense. I guess God was making his point on that. And you can see that in the movie, The Ten Commandments. And I need to point this out to you, too, that when you read through Psalms, some of the Psalms are written by the sons of Korah. So it wasn't, God was merciful. It wasn't his entire family. It was his direct relatives were swallowed up. But some of his descendants were leading worship for Israel. So, that's pretty cool that God is that worshipful and that gracious. And so when we say God doesn't have any grandchildren, well, sin doesn't have any grandchildren either. And I believe it's in Jeremiah. It says something about the teeth of a person is not set on edge. In other words, the point of that was that if you have kids and you're not a believer, they could be believers. And the reverse also is true. 14,700 people died from the plague, in addition to those who had died because of Korah. 14,000. So that was a few less that Moses had to rule over. There was a business meeting. Our church had burnt down after about 6 years or so, and we went through the building process, and some people in the church thought, well, we have this cool new church, we ought to get a new pastor too. So I had enforced the rules of the church that you couldn't vote unless you were a member. And so the people that opposed me went out and found people that hadn't gone to church for years and brought them in. I don't know what they told those people, but they voted against me. And I narrowly won. And so the leader of that movement that stood against me said, well, so, basically we could see the writing on the wall. You barely won. You ought to just, tuck your tail between your legs and leave. And I said, no, I know what you did. You went out and called up a lot of people that hadn't been coming to church, and I don't know what you told them. But that was the result. So the next thing on the agenda at that business meeting was a raise for me. I had been unbelievably underpaid for years and years. And one of the nice ladies in the church said, well, he should get a significant raise. So that was the next vote that came up, and about 2-3 people voted against the raise. So it was a lot of people that came back into the church and found out what was going on. So out of 600 603,505 people that the scripture says Moses was ruling over in Numbers 2, verse 32, 14,700 of them died. All right, well, if you're going to hang on, then I want to talk a little bit about the New Testament. Particularly, I think you'll understand most of what is in your New Testament reading this week, but I want to look at Mark chapter 13. That's an account of Jesus with the disciples, and Jesus, the master teacher, looked at the temple that was being built, and he said to the disciples, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down." And so the disciples, particularly Peter, James, John, and Andrew, wanted to know about that. And they said, "Tell us, when will these things be?" That's question number one. And question number two, two-part question, you could say, what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? Well, he told them when, basically, it would happen in AD 70, when the Romans would come in and knock down the temple, which also signified the end of the of Judaism and that religion. It also initiated, because that happened after the day of Pentecost, when the church began on the day of Pentecost, a new dispensation of the church. And then, to make things clear to the Jews, the temple was taken down. I talked to a young Jewish fella who now I think is probably in med school, or he's even a doctor. And I asked him, he had been going to temple and was raised Jewish. I said, why don't you sacrifice animals anymore? And he said, because the temple's not here. Well, it makes sense. So anyway, Jesus said, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. He said, do not be frightened. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. Now, keep in mind, if you check it out in Zechariah 12, that the Jews, these disciples, were Jewish, and they didn't understand what Paul was going to explain, like primarily in Romans 11, that there's a change, that there's going to be a church age after Christ left. So all they understand is what they would have known, for instance, in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27, which is a remarkable timeline that spells out from the time of Daniel, basically, until Christ coming in on the cult. And then it takes up, after that, of the time of a 7-year tribulation period, and then a millennial period where Christ rules on earth for 1,000 years. So that's all the disciples would understand. So when Jesus is talking about these things, this is what he's talking about. In verse 8 of 13, he says, the nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, and there will also be famines. And these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs, not fangs. Birth pangs. So, what he's describing is that 7-year tribulation period, but he says that's the beginning of things by which you will recognize this time. Now, I think that these birth pangs have already begun. I could be wrong, but I don't think so, like Monk would say. what's going on now? Wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes. How often do you open your email in the morning and see headlines about another tsunami? That's in Luke 17:21, I believe. Wars and rumors of wars. And where is everything baking now? In the Middle East, right? Israel, in the center of everything. So, some people that believe the way I believe think that these things don't mean anything. We just have better communication. But I don't think so. I think what we're seeing is that we're right on the edge of that period. And at the end of this chapter, it says, be alert. Anyway, in verse 14 of Mark 13, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Now, of course, he's talking about Jews, but he's also talking about a statue, I believe, of the Antichrist. And Jesus in Mark 13 says, if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or behold, he is there, do not believe him. That's verse 21. Verse 22, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show signs and wonders in order to lead astray, if possible, the elect. So those who are believers during that time, they could get confused, but they won't be. And verse 23, take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance. Then it says the Son of Man will be coming in the clouds, an Old Testament quote, in verse 26, and that's Christ coming at the end of the tribulation period. And as I mentioned, we need to be on the alert. The rapture, I believe, could happen at any time, the removing of the church before that literal 7-year period. All right, let's get to Psalms quickly. I've talked about categorizations of the Psalms, and so every week I have any time at all, I want to go through those quickly for you because I think they're helpful. Psalm 48, I think, is a psalm about Jerusalem, which we could classify as a canticle of Zion, of Jerusalem. 49, Psalm 49, a wisdom psalm. Psalm 50, in Numbers, Moses defended himself against his critics, and he said, I've never even taken a donkey. God says he doesn't want any bull. He says if he was hungry, he wasn't going to tell us. So Moses didn't want a donkey. God didn't want any bull. And that psalm is like one almost of a type, an exhortation or a covenant renewal liturgy. There might be another one. People might assign it a different type, but I think basically it's an exhortation. I'm going to skip 51. 52 talks about fools and is actually quoted in Romans 3. And that one could be an exhortation. It could be a lament, which most of the Psalms are, or it could be a thanksgiving. 53 could be a lament. 54, David's saying, and the psalmist is saying, vindicate me. He feels like he's done what God has wanted him to do. That's another lament of the individual. 51, pay attention to it. It's a lament of an individual. Specifically, we would call it a penitential psalm, meaning the guy who wrote it was really sorry. That's David. He wrote it after he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and he lost his son. And so he was in a sorry state. And if you're in a sorry state, read that. And let me point this out to you, which I think is pretty cool. The psalmist, David, says that because of what he's been through, he takes that information and teaches other sinners. That's always what we should do. All right, well, there you go. You've got the Korah of the issue, which is relationship with God leads to life. Rebellion against God leads to death. I'm sure we're going to find out that's going to be the next chapters that you read in your journey of the 1 Year Bible. And we'll talk about that next week. And I hope you'll tell your friends about what we're doing, if you like it. And if you don't like it, don't tell me. I guess you could. But don't tell your friends. And you can always check out, I just hitting the high points all the way through here, but I write a lot more and try to shrink down the best of everything out there, really, and the best of whatever I've learned and experienced is on spiritualrants.com. It's also known as jerryrothhauser.com. And, of course, you already know you can find the podcasts, or tell your friends if they don't know. You can find it, Spiritual Rants, on iTunes, Libsyn, YouTube, and Google Play. Again, keep your nose to the grindstone. Be encouraged. If you're reading through the Bible as much as you have the past few months, you know more than most believers out there. It's sad that they don't know more, but that's no excuse for you, not to continue to learn more. And we'll talk to you next week.